What does it look like to recognize that we read the Bible from the position of a particular culture? Hey everyone, welcome to another book review brought to you by our friends at Peniel Press, where good theology is good discipleship. Today I'm looking at Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, Removing Cultural Blinders to Better Understand the Bible by E. Randolph Richards and Brandon J. O'Brien. I enjoyed this book. I read it fairly quickly, but it's a needed book because many of us who come from the West, from North America, we can come and we can approach the Bible with kind of the cultural assumptions, the things, as they put in the book, the things that don't even need to be said, and we assume that is simply the only way to read the Scripture, or it's a natural way of reading Scripture, or we don't even realize we're reading it with that particular lens. And there are people across the world who don't believe that way, deep, faithful Christians, and in fact, the culture of the Bible is different than Western culture. And so sometimes we misread the Scripture, sometimes we miss things, and that's not to say that those who are, from the East in modern times don't have their own cultural blinders, but this is focusing for those of us in the West, what are ours? And the book looks at, as I said, the things that don't need to be said. The things that go without saying are just true and good and right within our culture, and how they are cultural and not universal, but also how they can shape the way we approach the Bible in sometimes unhelpful ways. And so the authors are really careful. I was a little nervous when I saw Western versus Eastern. As someone who's studied theology, who's studied history, I get nervous because sometimes these are oversimplifications. Sometimes people will, paint with these broad strokes that I think are inaccurate and misleading, or undermine some of the value in theology and in all of that. But these guys are very careful. They name what they're doing and what they're not doing. They're naming early on that there are dangers of using this language and that they're trying to avoid that. And then as you read through the book, they're extremely careful when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to theology, when it comes to history, when it comes to culture. They are careful. They are nuanced. And to me, that gives a significant amount of credibility to the project that they're doing, because they recognize its strengths and their own limitations in the midst of it. And so they look at kind of three layers. They look at the things above the surface, things we could probably tell are different from culture to culture, and how sometimes that affects our reading of the Bible. Then they'll look at the things below the surface, things that maybe we don't think about very much, but with a little bit of nudging, we could see that these are differences. We might be less likely to move on those than some of the above the surface things. And then they look at deep below the surface, those things that we can't even imagine being different. And we might get very emotional, very passionate about defending, even if they are actually something that's cultural and not universal and not necessarily biblical. And so, above the surface, he's talking about different, moral convictions, different understandings of race and ethnicity, and even different language. So, for instance, with language, they talk about how, some languages have lots of words for one thing and not a lot of words for another thing because of what they value or what they, commonly experience. So some languages have multiple different words for rice, depending upon whether it's in the field or whether it's been harvested or whether it's been cooked. English just has one word. Famously, Greek has multiple words for love, whereas we only have one, and they are able to differentiate between different kinds of love and different kinds of relationships. And we struggle with that at times in the West, simply because our language doesn't give us multiple words for it. On the flip side, there are things that we have a lot of words for that other languages have very few. Even just being here in Canada and being from the Midwest in the States, we have lots of different words for snow, different kinds of snow, depending on where it comes from. Other places, they just have the word snow if it happens at all. There are just certain things based on where you are, what culture you're in, that you might have a lot of words for or very few. And translating, some words are just difficult to translate. Some concepts are difficult to translate between one language and another. And you say that and like, okay, that kind of makes sense. I can see that. But then they go deeper to things that we might be less likely to move on. Individualism versus collectivism. Do we preference what's best for the individual or what's best for the group? And how do we read the Bible in that? Do we read it as about us or about me? Right? The word, back to language, the word you in English could be singular or plural. And depending, most of the time in the Bible it is plural, but we tend to read it as if it's singular here in the West because that's our assumptions. That goes without saying that if it's something really important, it would be about the individual, not about the group. And not all cultures are like that, but also the way the Bible was written, this can be a way that we misread or misapply the Bible. Honor and shame versus right and wrong, those are really key concepts, and I think they do a good job of both explaining it and saying how difficult it is to explain. And the one that stuck with me in this category was time. So they tell, in the West, we have a lot of words for time because we view time as a limited commodity. We view it like a commodity, and because of that, we want to be very precise. We want to measure it. We want to use it well. We want to spend it well and not waste it. All these kind of economic words around time. I'm recording this at 8:55, and there could be timestamps that are very specific down to the second within this video if we wanted it. That's how we view time, and because of that, we have values of punctuality and vices of tardiness, and we assign moral value to that within our culture of those who are punctual versus those who are tardy. We say we assign moral value to those who show up on time, and we assume poor morals for those who don't, because that's what our culture values. But different cultures view things differently. One example they used was in Indonesia, where one of the authors was serving for a time. They would say that church started at midday, and as a translator, he didn't know what that meant. He'd been told it meant probably around 10:30. But it took him a couple years to realize, it's all over the place as far as it's later, it's earlier, what's happening with this church service or with this designation of midday, until he realized it was about temperature. When it gets hot, it's midday, and it's afternoon once it cools off. And that makes sense. I can understand that, but it's so foreign to how I understand time with my watch, with my phone, with my alarms, on my phone with stopwatches, all of that. It's both something I can understand, but I can't imagine living in a way that is so fundamentally different to how I see the world and how I see time. And, he's not saying necessarily one is better than the other. He's, in this instance, is giving some different ways in some of the ways the Bible speaks in one and speaks versus the other. But, it hits on that this is a cultural thing that goes without saying that this is how you understand time. And when you go deep below the surface, you're talking about rules and relationships. In the West, we think a rule has to apply 100% of the time, and we will choose a rule over a relationship with a person quite regularly because we think if it is a rule, it can't have exceptions. Whereas other places in the world, a rule can have exceptions. And that is just deeply not the way that we understand the world. And that is kind of a fascinating difference to wrestle with when it comes to our cultural assumptions being read into the Bible versus potentially different cultural assumptions that would be read into the Bible. and then what counts as a virtue and what counts as a vice. And so in the West, we have certain things that we are taught from birth that are true and good and right, and we believe that they're biblical, or at least, universally good. And some of them may be biblically neutral, some of them may actually be antithetical to what the Bible teaches, but all of those, we have a tendency to read them into the Bible and want to justify our cultural values through what we read in Scripture. And the last thing they talk about is just that it's centered on ourselves. When we think about what is God's will, again, that kind of individualism versus collectivism, we're thinking about ourselves. And we have trouble thinking any differently because it's so ingrained in our culture. It was a really fascinating book. It's jarring in the best way. You'll likely find places that are uncomfortable, you might even disagree with, and I think that's okay. And I liked in the conclusion that instead of saying, these are the 3 steps to remove your cultural blinders, they say, it just can't work that way. It's going to take a long time, and you're never going to remove them completely, but you're going to be able to be more expansive if you can read from different cultures and different time periods of different Christians. You're going to be able to see a bit through some of the cultural blind spots that you may have or I may have, and also that there's a danger of overcorrecting. Once we see, oh man, I read from an American perspective, then we want to sort of throw all of that out and try to pretend as if we can read as if we're an Easterner, as opposed to saying like, no, we need to sort of see through the blinders, but we can never not be where we are. And so to kind of be more expansive, to be more balanced, to be able to see more clearly what's going on scripturally and where the gap is between their culture and ours, so that we can understand that as we seek to live faithfully into what Scripture says. But really an interesting book. I would recommend it if you're interested in the culture of the Bible or interested in trying to read the Bible more clearly. I'll put a link to the book down below. If you want to buy the book, it will help the authors, but also if you use our link, it helps us and the work that we're doing here at Peniel Press, helps support the channel. And thank you for your time, and God bless.